Are you a connoisseur of multi-attacking, but also like your fair share of aggressive tempo plays? Then this might be the deck for you. Stand up! Vanguard! While the world changed around them, the forest of Zoo stayed relatively isolated. In the heart of these regions lays the great Retia Valley. This oasis, hidden from the outside world, is the home of all kinds of mythical creatures. With 3,000 years of isolation made these animals fuse with nature itself. This mythical kingdom is ruled by Magnolia. Sylvan Horned Beast King Magnolia is the king of all beasts in the great Retia Valley. He not only wields exceedingly strong powers, but also holds infinite wisdom. His gentle rule and affinity with nature made him loved and respected by not only the beast he commands, but by all living beings. Don't be fooled by his gentle nature, as when his enemies threaten his domain, he will show his ferocious side, as the Sylvan Horned Beasts are powerful creatures. This ferocity is best seen in Magnolia's Vanguard ability, as he is able to not only empower his units, but also to allow them to attack from the back row, thus unleashing a barrage of multi-attacks. And on the turn where you can persona ride Magnolia, you can unleash his true power, as now he can empower 3 units and thus also enable the entire back row to attack from the back row, thus granting you the access to 6 attacks on the board. This makes Magnolia a real threat, as he's able to unleash a barrage of multi-attacks right out of the gate the moment he enters the field, and will only become stronger the longer the game progresses. Now, Magnolia is only as good as its rear guards, as they are the one that's doing the work, so his support cards are going to be very pivotal for his strategy. Luckily, we do have some very good cards for Magnolia to work with, and one of those cards being the brand new grade 2, which is Sylvan Horned Beast Daimonaru. This card is basically a mini Magnolia on a rear guard circle, as it is another card that allows you to get an extra multi-attack attack. And this is great for the earlier turns, because on turn 3, you can only achieve 4 attacks with Magnolia because you need a persona ride. If you have this card, you can add 1 extra attack on top of it. But this card is also great in the scenarios where you cannot persona ride but still want to unleash at least more attacks. But on top of it, it can also be a solid 20k attacker if it's targeted by Magnolia's effect, thus making it an excellent target on turn 3 if you went first, because it becomes a 20k attacker against your opponent's 10k unit. Now, one thing that Magnolia struggles quite a bit is its soul resources, as a lot of the very powerful cards use a soul, like Daimonaru for example. Luckily, we got a new supporting card which can help us to fix this issue in the likes of Sylvan Horned Beast Elrante. Elrante is basically another very good beater, as it can become a solid 23k beater, but it can also generate a soul if we can create the correct setup. This is definitely a very good card to put behind your Vanguard column, because at the very least, this will then always be a 23k attacker, because you and your opponent will always have a Vanguard in the same column. And a 23k attacker means it's always going to be a solid attack, even if your opponent hits a defensive trigger, unlike most 20k beaters that we see in most grade 2s. Now, another very good support card for Magnolia is Sylvan Horned Beast Ginosla. This card allows us to put real numbers behind our attacks and get more value off of our triggers, as we can pass the power around to other columns. Ideally, you want to be able to put all your power effects onto this card so you can pass around to the next attack, thus making defensive triggers matter less in the face of a Ginosla. Now, as you might expect, as seen as Magnolia is all about rear guards, your rear guards are going to be very important, and sometimes your resources might run low. Luckily, we got a new addition in our order lineup, which can allow us to combat this problem in the face of retires, as we've got a brand new grade 0 normal order called Wild Intelligence. This is effectively the recursion drop zone resurrection effect for Magnolia, as it not only allows us to get 1, but actually 2 rear guards for the cost of 1 counterblast. And the mill on top of it can allow us to get more options, as if we use this in the early game, we might not have the good targets in our drop zone, but by milling them, we have the chance of actually hitting those cards that we need. A big thing that Magnolia lacks is big numbers behind its columns, but this can be fixed thanks to the card Sylvan Horned Beast Cozy. Cozy is a really interesting card which allows us to do 3 different things. It's a solid attacker and target for Magnolia because it's 15k base. Getting the 5k power buff of Magnolia makes it a 20k attack, so it hits the same numbers as Daimonaru against an opponent's grade 2 10k. But it can also be used as a really good Vanguard booster for a Magnolia attack, because normally Magnolia is just 13k, or in a Persona ride, 23k. But if you have a cozy behind it and you boost with it, you actually are generating a 28k or 38k attack on your Vanguard attack. But there's a third application to this card thanks to a new card which allows you to move it from the back row center circle to the side columns or potentially the front row, thus being able to empower all your circles or all your columns, making this card even more flexible. That card being Maiden of Deep Impression Urgula. Urgula is a very interesting card which allows us to manipulate the field in ways that we can normally not. The obvious interaction is of course with Kusi, but this card also allows us to fix our field if we went to an early aggression on turn 2, we just called a bunch of cards, but their position on the board isn't as ideal, and with a card like this, we can fix that and move them to the correct setup the moment that we want to go for our grade 3 and later push turns. Now there's one more card that I want to highlight for Magnolia, and that is their grade 2 Blitz Order Ghost Chase. This is effectively a 5k shield just like your grade 1s and grade 2s, but with a very important skill addition where it allows you to bounce back your cards from the field. This not only allows us to protect certain key units that we really need, but more importantly, it allows us to reuse on place effects. One of those cards being of course Daiminaru. Being able to use the same Daiminaru turn after turn after turn is really good, especially if we cannot consistently Persona Ride. But it also has different applications because our right line for Magnolia allows us to superior call the top cards of the deck, and this card also interacts really nicely with Wild Intelligence because we can resurrect Magnolia Persona Red copies from the drop zone, thus securing our Persona Red next turn, or we can call down triggers like the Over Trigger or Perfect Guard to get those extra shield value for the following turns. Now I already teased a bit about the right line for Magnolia with Ghost Chase, as the main right line you want to use is the generic Magnolia right line, which makes you go from Charis into Lettuce into Magnolia himself. This right line is really good if you want to go for a more early aggressive approach, because both the grade 1 and the grade 2 allows you to get a unit onto the board and thus giving you the access to attacking multiple times right at the gate without needing to dedicate cards from hand. This also set up very nicely your Magnolia push turns, as you can already get bodies on the board which can generate or fuel those potential 6 attacks. And in the case those targets aren't as great as they are supposed to be, then you have Ghost Chase to get them back, or if they're grade 2s, you can just intercept them away for that shield value. But that said, if you want to go very spicy, you can opt to go for the Zorga right line for going into Rancor Chain and Husk Dragon if you're gonna focus more on a lot of orders, because the new Magnolia deck actually can run quite a lot of number of orders with the inclusion of Wild Intelligence as well as Harvesting Season, Ghost Chase, and maybe something like Spiritual Condensation. So depending on your playstyle and how you want to build a deck, there's definitely room for opting for the other right line as well. Triggers in the Magnolia are quite interesting because you can make an argument for any type of triggers. Crits are really good because you come with pressure, and usually most players want to take the Vanguard attack, thus having the chance of hitting a defensive trigger and making all the other attacks much easier to guard, as they're usually not that high. Now front triggers are also immediately really good because it empowers 3 of your 6 attacks, thus generating a lot of power on the board, and usually you empower the back row units with skills and you leave your front row units a bit underwhelming, so the front triggers can help in that department. But draws are also actually really important for Magnolia because you need to be able to create a field every single turn to capitalize on all your effects and your multi-tech potential. And the deck really relies on specific key cards, so with those extra draws you're much more likely to get those cards and to create those scenarios. But personally I would more hinge towards the 4 heals, 7 crits, 4 draws and the over trigger lineup, because I feel less need for front triggers by the sheer fact that those 2 extra attacks that are weaker are probably also the first attacks that I'm gonna use, and I mainly want to have the power onto my back row with all these special abilities, and they don't get the benefit from the front trigger. And draws feel way more important to me because I need to have access to all those specific key cards, and also something like Wild Intelligence to replenish the board as fast as possible. For the build in this video, I went for a more generic overall round approach. So this is a build that is relatively good in most scenarios. It can be a bit aggressive in the early game, but it definitely has some long-lasting potential in your turn 4, 5, 6 plays. So it's a mix of both worlds. So as you can see here, we basically have everything that we need to do our plays for Magnolia. We got the Magnolia right line, which allows us to call units into the early game. We got the Persona right copies. We also got the El Rente for the soul resource that we need for Daibinaru as well as for Lettuce. That said, we have of of course, are 4 copies of Daimyonaru to increase the consistency of being able to push out 5 to 6 attacks without needing to Persona Ride every single turn. We got the 2 copies of Genosla. The main reason I only play 2 is that the counterblast cost can be a bit heavy if I'm going too much on it, because I do need the counterblast for Magnolia every single turn. And of course, Wild Intelligence now also use a counterblast, so I want to be a bit more conservative with Genosla. I also have the 2 main deck copies of Lattice. This is just another good target for Magnolia to give it extra power, because it can be a solid 25k power if I use the Soul, but I need to be careful to not overextend it, because if I cannot use El Rante on a consistent basis, I much rather want to use it for Daimyonaru if my opponent's already at 4 or 5 damage. Now, because we run Magnolia right line, I also want to include the Ghost Chases, because they give us the option to bounce back miscall targets from the right line, so triggers, over triggers, PGs, not really great cards that I can use in those earlier turns. Maybe it's an early Daimyonaru, which isn't that great. This allows us to bounce them back, and that said, it also allows us to reuse the same Daimyonaru turn after turn, which is great if we cannot get consistent access of Magnolia. Now, overall, the main strategy of this deck is relatively straightforward. You have your right line to be a bit more aggressive in the early game. You can call extra cards to the field if you want to push. A good card to call very early on is Kusi, because that basically means your opponent can no longer guard the Vanguard attack with just a trigger. You want to try to capitalize on your El Rantes as being really solid beaters, same as the Lattice as regular units. Those hits also very good over defensive triggers. And you got your Genosla to potentially move on triggers, and your Daimyonaru to basically give you the potential of 5 attacks on your very first Great Free turn. Now, one point of advice with the right line of Magnolia, you don't always have to rely on Lattice right skill. You don't always have to use the Soul Blast skill to call something, because that Soul Blast can also be used by a rearguard Lattice to get power or to achieve multi-attacks with Daimyonaru. Sometimes that might be a bit better than just using it to call the top card of your deck. So always think about resolving that skill, because it isn't a thing that you should always do. It depends on the scenario you find yourself in. The free call can be nice, but Soul is a very important resource for Magnolia. But one thing that you might have noticed from this list is that this list is relatively heavily focused on your Great Free turn and onwards. There isn't a lot of emphasis on the early game except for your Earlias and your Kosis, which is definitely not enough to be very aggressive out of the gate. There are, however, different options that you can tweak to this list, which allows you to basically turn the list into something completely different, which is definitely more on the early aggro rush that then uses the Magnolia multi-attack as the actual finisher of your deck. If you want to go that strategy, then you might be interested in a list that looks a bit like this. So there are basically 3 new additions in this list, which basically enables this early aggression. And one of those cards being the Grade 2 Spurring Maiden Elenia. These are resurrection cards, which allows us to flood the board on the early game, and this is another card that uses Soul, which is another reason why you might not always want to use Lattice, because at the very least, this card gives you the card that you need, or you can choose which card is going to come on the board. Now, you can use this on turn 2 to basically resurrect a card that you discarded for the right line. So if you discard any of your other Grade 2s, then you can definitely use this card to put it back onto the board, and now you can immediately start swinging with 3 attacks on turn 2. So this is a great card to just keep flooding units onto the board and be aggressive right out of the gate. Another card that complements this playstyle, and in Linea especially, is Sylvan Hornbeast Duger. This is just a 15k beater when you can flood the board, and this is a good target to call off of Linea if you just want to create as big numbers as possible without needing to waste more resources like a Daimyonaru or a Genosla, as they do cost Soul or Counterblast. And then a final new inclusion in this list is the new normal Grade 2 order Harvesting Season. This is just a power buff to your back row. The only downside is that this card blocks those units from boosting, and they cannot move, but you just use this the moment you go into the battle phase, so that restriction doesn't really matter. But the fact that they cannot boost can come up if you use this card too early and they hit a defensive trigger, and now your back row units cannot hit anymore, as well as your front row units, and because you cannot boost with those units, then the whole thing just falls apart and your turn is over. This card is basically here if your opponent is at 4 or 5 damage. You know you can potentially kill them, but you need that extra bit of oomph. You can use this card to give those extra attacks at 5k power, which can definitely be the threshold to get over the defensive capabilities of your opponent, and thus allowing you to secure and end the game right on the spot. Overall, this strategy does have the same application as the previous one, but this build heavily incentivizes you to be more aggressive in the early game with the Dugers, the Lineas, and you have more finishing power with the new Harvesting Season. Now, you can also use the Order Wild Intelligence as a more aggressive card in the early game, because In the early game, you can still use the effect to counterblast 1, mill 3, and resurrect 1 card, thus allowing you to be a bit more aggressive. And those 3 mills can potentially set up a linea. If they gave you enough counterblast, you can opt to combo those 2 cards together to get more value. Now, besides this list, there are even more different alternatives for Magnolia, which allows you to customize this particular strategy or the previous strategy that we just talked about. One of those cards being Conspiring Mutant Admantis. This is basically a card that just gives more power to the board, and this can be really abused with our resurrection skills like a Linea or a Wild Intelligence or even Ghost Chase to keep bouncing it back to the field. This is another great way to either be more aggressive in the early game or to capitalize on your late game multi-attack to just put more power on the board, as you can give the power also to Ginosla, which then can pass it on to another unit. Another card that can work with the new Magnolia upgrades is the Grade 2 Sylvan Hornbeast Angleo. This is another card which can allow you to sacrifice to give 2 units plus 5k power. Now that might not sound all too great, but with the new upgrades to our resurrection options with Wild Intelligence, you might be able to get away with this by just putting more power onto the board and sacking this off, and then with Wild Intelligence repopulate the board, and that then allows you to compensate for that loss, but you did generate more power onto the board. And this can also combine very nicely with Ginosla as another way to generate more power overall. And then finally, we can focus on more orders for Magnolia, because if we want to go for the Zorga right line, you can opt to increase the amount of orders you play. We also got our Spiritual Condensation, which is yet another card which allows us to resurrect cards to the field. It does cost soul, but with the new Elrond as a soul engine, we might be able to get away with it. But beyond Spiritual Condensation, we also got the new Grade 3 normal order Regurgitation of the Underworld, which also gives Magnolia the option to field control your opponent and then also generate more value onto the board. And with a vast array of Grade 2s, Grade 3s, and Grade 1s, you can always resurrect 1 card no matter what you're going to retire off your opponent. And the last sort of card that might work with Magnolia is Nectar of Sensationalism. This is just another way to put insane amount of power to the board and give Magnolia crit pressure if the game is going on long enough. And with the fact that we can soul charge and soul blast all our cards, we have our new mill mechanic with Wild Intelligence, we might get to this 15 soul requirement more consistently than you might think, thus being able to use this skill on a good push turn when you're going to Persona Ride, for example. And you can give this power to Ginosla and then pass that 15k power onto another unit, which is actually pretty devastating in the right circumstances. And that basically sums up the basics for Magnolia. Now, there are definitely a lot more details that are overlooked in this video, because there goes so much more into when to know when to call a certain card or when not to call certain cards, knowing when to attack with something or not to attack, and also knowing to decide if you want to attack into an opponent's Vanguard or into their rear guards. Because keep in mind, Magnolia doesn't have spot removal if you don't use the Regurgitation of the Underworld order card, and that means you need to use your attacks into your opponent's units. And you might think to yourself, well, if they get a defensive trigger, I will just ram into them with the rear guards. Keep in mind, a lot of decks nowadays will run the 10 new front triggers, those 20k shield front triggers, and if they hit that front trigger, it is possible that your units don't even hit their rearguard. So in some instances, maybe just hitting into their rearguards first might be more beneficial for you, because they have the option to hit the defensive front trigger. So knowing all these details and knowing what to call a card in the early game, mid game, late game, and knowing when to attack what or not is very important to excel in using this deck, as that will be the factor that will differentiate the beginners from the experts. So go out there and try to experiment and perfect your Magnolia playstyle and change it up to how you like to play and what type of value you value much higher than other players, because there's so much more to learn, and the best way to learn this is just by playing yourself. But with that said, I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters over patreon.com/VanguardInsider. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/VanguardInsider and become a Patreon today. But with that said, I've been Mr. Time Leap, and I see you guys in the next one!